The Sator square is a letter square comprised of multidimensional palindromes, meaning that they can be read in any direction. It is believed that this ceremonial inscription was a cipher for the Christian prayer Pater Noster, when rearranged only excluding the O's and A's, which are thought to represent the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Each word in the square has a Latin translation besides arepo, which is believed to be a mistranslation of Aleppo, a Greek-Hebrew hybrid of the Alpha and Omega. While the intended order of the words remains unknown to this day, a possible solution for this ancient puzzle is the Alpha and Omega hold the wheels in work. Or rather, Jesus makes God's work possible. The Sator square is a collection of letters which are interpretable from multiple angles, much like the film from which it is inspired features characters moving in multiple directions through time, with Sator being the big bad, Rotas the Freeport security team, Arepo the art forger, Tenet the organization, and the film opening at an opera. And much like the inclusion of the Sator square in the film, Tenet itself is far more concerned with sentiment than substance. This is a Chris Nolan joint, so you know what that means. Classy acting, questionable sound design, and effects more practical than actually sitting through the collapse of a skyscraper during an earthquake. And these factors are all very refreshing, especially in combination, until you realize that Tenet dials the sound design up from questionable to laughably lamentable.
So close! Ukraine's expecting a passenger.
Seals up the outer river. Well, we better put our head home before the bomb goes off,
Covering the tracks.
Taking out the audience.
It's just the cheap seats. On our mission. Come on now.
See you on me this side.
The same sunshine we bask in will warm the faces of our descendants generations to come.
Terminal. From their private planes, of course.
The rate at which information is delivered to the audience is uncomfortable, to put it lightly. Once you realize what just happened, the next scene has already started, and you still don't fully understand what came before. The plot moves at breakneck speed from one long-winded piece of exposition to another mind-bending spectacle with no regard for the audience's comprehension of what is happening, and connective scenes that might have eased the viewer's narrative jet lag are bizarrely absent. The cherry on top of this deceptively sweet cake is the scientist lady at the beginning saying,
"Don't try to understand it. Feel it."
Don't worry about the details, just enjoy the show. Fuck that. A review of Tenet without criticism of the time travel mechanic is like a time travel movie without a verbal concession about the time travel mechanic not making sense.
Because if we start talking about it, then we're gonna be here all day talking about it, making diagrams with straws. It doesn't matter.
What's happened's happened. Which is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world.
Doesn't matter!
The film, much like its own title, is palindromic. It starts at the opera, moves towards the highway heist where our heroes invert to travel back to the time of the climax at Stalsk 12. Although any explanation deeper than that requires a pinboard and red yarn, do not get me started on the audacity of certain people who assert that mentioning Feynman and Wheeler's theory, Maxwell's demon, or any of the godforsaken laws of thermodynamics is necessary to understanding Tenet. Save it for the girl at the party who you couldn't initially impress with the photos of your Rick and Morty merch collection. There are more pressing matters to attend to, such as the very idea of inverting entropy. Not time travel, says Nolan, whipping out his prehensile penis at the Board of Investors meeting. Inversion. As in, making a person or object travel backwards through time while everything else continues forwards. While Primer saw fit to limit its method of time travel to whatever you can fit inside a coffin-sized box with you, Tenet sees characters go through a sort of temporal revolving door. Instead of teleporting the subject to an earlier time period, they must spend the same amount of time traveling backwards as they would have had to forwards, and instead of being stuck in a quirky refrigerator, the characters are free to interact with their surroundings. Backwards. They say that coming into contact with your inverted self would mean utter annihilation, but a thin barrier of tactical gear in between suffices as a sort of pseudoscientific band-aid. They say that certain situations are unknowable, and yet the organization's master plan relies on time being deterministic and characters following preordained paths. They say that cause and effect are at play in the world, but the film is entirely predicated on a grandfather paradox, that being the protagonist, who I will henceforth refer to as JD, recruiting Neil in the future so that he could travel back in time and save JD at the opera and in the mine. This raises a mechanical as well as a philosophical problem. How does free will work in this model of time? Cause and effect are all but illusions once you realize there is no possible divergence from the set path. What's happened sounds like a concise explanation of the inversion mechanic that doubles as a thought-provoking message, but is little more than a multi-layered metaphysical palindromic cop-out if you ask me. This model of time travel, while easy enough to understand as a loop which we observe to close over the course of the film, is entirely paradoxical. The future is equally as dependent on the past as the past is dependent on the future. Inversion inverts cause and effect, making the effect appear to be the cause and rendering any semblance of free will meaningless. Everything that will happen has happened and is unchangeable because there only exists one version of the event. This interpretation of time travel, as confusing as it may seem, is indistinguishable from hitting a cosmic rewind button.
But cause comes before effect.
No, that's just the way we see time.
While there's something oddly satisfying about knowing that we're simply seeing scattered cross-sections of a closed loop, meaning that there is no possibility of loose ends, it kills any semblance of stakes or character agency. The inversion mechanic is deterministic. After all, the blue team's future intel would be worthless to the red team if events could in any way diverge from their preordained routes. What we're seeing is on rails, set in stone. JD's victory is a foregone conclusion because without it he would never have established the organization in the future in order to facilitate everything we saw leading up to his victory in the present. The notion of deterministic time also undermines the idea of malicious intent during cross-temporal combat. When JD is fighting himself at the Freeport, both of them are simply trying to survive each other's attacks in the moment. JD Prime has no idea how to fight an inverted opponent and so is just going with the reverse flow, and inverted JD is simply trying to defend himself from JD Prime's attempts at self-preservation. All of this taking place simultaneously gives the illusion of a fight, but is actually more akin to a professional patty cake routine, scripted and entirely unthreatening. Besides the existentially disappointing nature of the inversion mechanic, it allows for some exciting ideas to be explored, such as inverted bullets doing extra damage because wounds caused by inverted objects cannot be treated by anything moving conventionally through time, or JD's unhealing stab wound, inflicted upon him by a knife traveling in the opposite temporal direction, meaning that he developed the injury on his way towards the Freeport, and when he was stabbed, the wound disappeared. And when Neil leaves to sacrifice himself by unlocking the gate in the mine, he actually would have held the gate open and locked it before being shot because he was inverted. The fact that Nolan thought about all these details, the manner in which all these elements interact at the micro and macro levels, and paid incredible attention to detail with a comically complex interpretation of time travel, makes it all the more disillusioning to address what he got wrong. Firstly, Tenet goes off the rails suggesting that inverting entropy would also invert the effects of heat, a sight to behold but nonsense all the same. And secondly, it doesn't go far enough in that, surely, inverting oneself to the point that they would be moving against the flow of time itself would also invert their consciousness. Whether deliberate or not, Nolan's take on time travel implies that our subjective experience of the material world, essentially our essence, is somehow separate from the laws of physics that govern the rest of the universe. If oxygen tanks are necessary for inverted people to breathe, then why shouldn't chemical supplements or conductive helmets be necessary for their brains to function normally while inverted? Tenet introduces us to a highly intriguing version of time travel, but if it remained consistent with the mechanic it established and followed it to its logical conclusion, going through a turnstile would mean imprisoning yourself in a psychological hell as you would experience everything in reverse, not just the physical world but your own thoughts as well, leaving it up to chance whether you would ever be able to go back through the turnstile or if you could even perceive what you were doing at all. Not to mention the insane consequences inversion would have on world history. Was that side mirror broken during manufacturing? Was that guy stuck in that wall during construction of the building? Was that gate locked for all the time leading up to Neil opening it? At what point do inverted bullets revert back to their base components or even base elements? Do the particles of inverted objects reach as far back as the Big Bang? And if so, what the hell would happen to them when they arrive at the beginning, or in their case, the end of the universe? Considering how little we know about time or consciousness, Tenet's inversion mechanic is plausible, just inconsistent. One thing I will unabashedly praise Nolan for is making movies that necessitate repeat viewings. Nolan has an implicit respect for his audience like few other writers and directors do, in that he's willing to make his work so intellectually stimulating. The fact that creators like him essentially get blank checks to bring to life whatever artistic visions they can dream up is extremely reassuring for modern cinema, and the fact that logically consistent writing is not yet extinct is another silver lining among Hollywood's current stormfront of lowest common denominator sewage. Now if only we could get these two factors at play in a single project. Don't get me wrong, Nolan's got it down when it comes to pushing the limits of high-concept practical effects, but a consistent screenwriter he is not. Tenet's narrative elements suffer greatly to make way for the spectacle it will surely go down in the history books for. Just like people will remember the concept behind Inception long after they've forgotten the characters and plot, so too will Tenet live on in spirit. While I can empathize with those who were left feeling intellectually humiliated by the film, I cannot abide by "it made me feel stupid" being treated as valid criticism. It is not a failure of storytelling to be difficult to understand without multiple viewings. A film has no obligation to make itself clearly understood the first time around, just like a painting has no obligation to be fully appreciated at first glance. Primarily because the world is at least semi-populated by people who couldn't tell the difference between an artist's creative vision, designed to enrich your outlook on life, and a committee-approved, advertiser-friendly product designed to appeal to your baser instincts and milk you for cash. But also because it is the role of the artist to decide how dense and nuanced they'd like to make their art. At the moment, most of us would look at the Mona Lisa with tacit indifference, not because we fully understand the effort that went into painting it and thus are numb to appreciating it, but because we don't fully understand it, and thus can revisit it time and time again gaining new insight and a deeper admiration for the painting on each subsequent viewing. Not enjoying a film because it made you feel stupid is like not enjoying a meal because it left you full. The worst films are the ones that don't take you outside your comfort zone, just as the worst meals leave you unsated, with a bland taste in your mouth, wishing you could forget the experience. It's not our place to tell the artist to dumb shit down so we can get our money's worth in a single sitting. If that were the case, then rewatchability would cease to exist and there'd be no point in collecting films. After all, you fully understood it on the first viewing. There were no subtle biblical Easter eggs that you missed or references to the author's other works that flew over your head. It has no value after the first viewing. A single-use piece of art. What a bleak world that would be. The first time I watched Tenet was during real coof hours in a cinema entirely populated by myself and two buds. It was a magical experience to have the whole theater to ourselves, free to gripe out loud about the ill-explained goals and wonky audio. Although I left the cinema confused, frustrated, and burdened by an algorithm-sized headache, at least I had the satisfaction of telling my buds about the Sator Square Easter egg before we watched any explain videos. Am I worthy yet, or I am very smart? But who could have predicted that after a second viewing with two other buds, it being their first watch, I would have been gifted another equally sized headache, as the plot still moved too fast to make sense of its self-masturbatory high concept and the sound was still obnoxiously intrusive. Too many lines are delivered casually, with subtlety. There's no difference in the delivery of vital plot information as opposed to the delivery of completely irrelevant drivel.
Same day as the Kiev Opera siege, we spotted a detonation in northern Siberia, just where Stultz 12 was. Catherine Barton, eldest niece of Sir Frederick Barton. She works at Shipley's, met Sator at an auction.
The scientist who built it took her own life so she couldn't be forced to make another.
A scientist in the future.
Generations from now. She devises a method for inverting the world, but becomes convinced that by destroying us, they're destroying themselves.
The grandfather paradox. Traced it back to a repo, then realized I scored a bargain when he told me who paid top dollar for another one of his pictures. Your husband.
Where's your bargain?
If you and I were to make an arrangement.
Arrangement? You mean blackmail? Don't be afraid of the word. My husband isn't.
He knows, and he's never done anything about it.
Why would he?
All expository dialogue is conveyed with the same gravity, making it a challenge to interpret what the movie wants you to focus on. Not only are many plot details not explained to viewers, the characters seem to have no emotional connection to their goals, carrying out their missions purely out of duty rather than any personal vested interests. Not inherently bad, but compounded with an almost incomprehensible plot, the lack of motivation likens the characters' allegedly important goals to going through the trouble of robbing a bank because your bro needed change for a 50. Kat is the soul of the film. Whereas JD and Neil move the story along in a detached, professional capacity, what happens between her and Sator constitutes Tenet's emotional core. But the film does not balance the sentimental and technical sides of the plot. The emotion is present when Kat and Sator are on screen and then absent otherwise. She is a third, at most one half, of the characters we're rooting for, but she alone cannot bear the weight of the whole narrative sentimentality. Tenet would have made a great anime. The plot stretched out over multiple episodes, possibly seasons, with room to breathe between the incredible visuals and convoluted plot twists, allowing for a deeper insight into the protagonist's character. As in, knowing anything about him beyond his favorite soft drink. Neil gets a pass because he's got twice the charm and is intended to have an air of mystery around him. As it stands, Tenet is not a movie as much as it is an intriguing and complex sci-fi concept that is explored via shallow characters being dragged along by an unsatisfying plot. It should tell you a lot about the film that discussing it almost requires that you mention the Sator Square, how red and blue signify temporal direction, the fact that all the stunts were filmed practically, design elements that are completely divorced from the writing, world-building, or characterization. I have no idea what the protagonist believes in or values beyond preventing World War III, but hey, at least I know that the title is a reference to the climactic battle being comprised of two 10-minute assaults intent on converging. Seriously, where's my prize? Tenet is not a mystery film. It's a predetermined path one man laid out for hundreds of others, including his past self, to follow. We're just along for the ride. It's all on rails. The movie tells us as much. Nolan's films have almost become a genre unto their own, but they don't get held to a different standard for that. Cough cough Tarantino fans. Excuse me, I meant to say Tarantino fans. Just because rom-coms and disaster movies are fundamentally different types of films doesn't mean they shouldn't obey basic standards of internal consistency or neglect the construction of their world and characters. The more films I watch, the more difficult it is to apply the same standard to all of them, but nevertheless, that is the most efficient way to discuss film as a whole. Tenet is good, for a sci-fi movie, is worth about as much as hot dogs are healthy, for junk food. Art might not be as calculated or precise as dietary sciences, but if you're going to die on the hill of everything is subjective, tell me that you liked or disliked it and be on your merry way. Any commentary deeper than that and you're suddenly venturing beyond the realm of your own personal feelings into that scary land known as middle ground, where we can agree on terminology and make progress towards something conclusive. Despite Nolan inviting us to put aside our skepticism and just enjoy the ride, he put an awful lot of work into making Inversion appear to make sense, and astonishingly still ended up with a take on time travel as structurally sound as grilled cheddar.
What's happened's happened.
What's happened's happened.
It's unknowable. If you're there to make a change, you're not here to observe its effect.
Which is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world. It's not an excuse to do nothing.
It's unknowable.
It's not an excuse to do nothing.
If you're there to make a change, you're not here to observe its effect.
Which is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world.
Tenet does everything in its power to avoid being forgettable, such that it's now burned onto my brain as a perennial source of migraines. Neil loves to talk about how deterministic time is. It's part of his closing speech and everything, until he contradicts himself and makes time out to be branching, which he himself entertains as plausible in spite of the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The intel that the Red Team got about Stulsk 12 would not have been worth anything if time weren't absolutely linear. There is nothing supporting the idea that making a change at one point in time will lead to a different outcome further down the road. Everything we're shown reinforces the idea that events are unchanging. What's happened has happened. If you are there to make a change, you are always going to be. If you are here to observe its effect, you are always going to be. Surprise is an illusion. Free will only exists in the characters' minds. The technology that facilitates this mind-boggling method of time travel is regarded with the gravity of both the potential catalyst for World War III and a mundane occurrence that well-versed characters explain to the new guy so he doesn't get fired on the first day on the job. Tenet is high concept, low everything else. Thin plot, shallow characters, weak motivations, and a vital narrative mechanic that clashes with the audience's investment. Knowing that the whole film is simply a loop preordained to spin endlessly like a nuclear-powered tumble dryer, rewatching Tenet demands that you ignore the utter lack of stakes. JD had the right idea. The fact that they are even alive to try to stop Sator means that he failed. The heroes won and were always going to. While the climactic battle might look epic, Nolan could have achieved a more palpable emotional reaction with a fraction of the characters and more emphasis placed on Kat and Sator. Bigger is not always better. Primer is the best time travel movie. What the hell was the point of the boating scene? I rest my case. While I truly believe this film was outwardly awesome but fundamentally flawed, I would take 100 Tenets over a single one of these any day.